The Yacht Club's spring commissioning dinner had always been an event of modest splendour and considerable self-importance. The clubhouse, a squat Edwardian structure of peeling white paint and ambitious bunting, stood bravely against the brownish waters of the estuary. Inside, trestle tables sagged beneath trifles, blanc-manges, and something determinedly labelled Sea Captain's Pie, though no captain had yet claimed responsibility for it. Commodore Basil Denholm, whose moustache was of greater distinction than his maritime record, rose from his chair with the careful gravity of a man who had rehearsed joviality in a mirror. A spoon struck a glass. Conversation dissolved into attentive murmurs. "My friends," he began, expanding slightly at the word, "it gives me particular pleasure to announce a most generous request to the club." A ripple passed along the tables. Mrs. Chalfont of the Ladies' Sailing Auxiliary adjusted her lorgnette. Young Timothy Rudge, who owned neither boat nor competence but attended faithfully for the gin, leaned forward with sudden patriotism. "An anonymous benefactor," Denholm continued, "has arranged for the donation of a new racing dinghy, a splendid craft, fast, modern, quite the envy of our neighbours in St. Bede's." Applause erupted with an enthusiasm out of proportion to the town's actual interest in sailing. In Flaxborough, envy of St. Bede's was a reliable stimulant. Denholm beamed. "The dinghy will, I am told, arrive tomorrow morning. It will bear a plaque tastefully discreet, honouring the spirit of competitive fellowship." There was more applause. Then, just as Denholm reached for his wine in what he hoped was a modestly statesmanlike manner, a voice emerged from the far end of the room. "What plaque?" The question did not ring out heroically. It drifted, puzzled, and faintly indignant. Its owner, Mr. Leonard Firth, club treasurer, and cautious guardian of other people's subscriptions, had half risen from his chair. "What plaque?" he repeated. Denholm's smile faltered in a way perceptible only to those accustomed to watching him closely, which in Flaxborough was most of the room. "The commemorative plaque, Leonard," he replied. "Surely you were informed?" Firth blinked. "I was informed of no such thing. I authorized no plaque, nor any racing dinghy." The applause subsided into a texture of whispering. Mrs. Chalfont lowered her lorgnette by half an inch, which for her signified acute alarm. Denholm cleared his throat. The letter was quite explicit. What letter? The letter accompanying the pledge. Firth's lips compressed into a narrow band of accountancy. No such letter has passed through the club's accounts. A silence settled that was less dramatic than awkward. Cutlery clinked tentatively. Someone coughed in a tone suggesting they had always suspected something irregular about plaques. From his seat near the window, Inspector Purbright observed the exchange with mild interest. He had attended as a courtesy, having once been persuaded to present a modest silver cup to a junior sailing competition, and thereafter considered almost one of us by the club's more optimistic members. Purbright was not a sailor. He regarded the estuary with the same thoughtful neutrality he afforded most human enthusiasms. It seemed to him that boats involved considerable effort for the sake of dampness. He sipped his mineral water and watched as Denholm and Firth conferred in increasingly urgent whispers. The Commodore produced a folded sheet from his breast pocket and passed it across the table. Firth adjusted his spectacles. His brows advanced in slow disapproval. "This," he announced, holding the paper at arm's length, "is not addressed to the treasurer, nor to the secretary. It is addressed to the esteemed leadership of the Flaxborough Yacht Club." A murmur travelled the room like a speculative breeze. "It was delivered by hand," Denholm insisted. "Left at the clubhouse on Tuesday, By whom? A young man, or possibly a delivery fellow. He wore something navy. In Flaxborough, something in the navy was insufficient identification. Firth tapped the letter. There is no signature. There is a signature, Denholm objected weakly. A scrawl is not a signature. The room began to divide itself into those who believed in generous anonymity and those who believed in receipts. Purbright leaned slightly toward Mrs. Chalfont, who had shifted her chair nearer to him under the pretext of better acoustics. "How very exciting," she whispered. "A mystery benefactor. It is like something in a novel." "Let us hope," Purbright murmured, "that it proves shorter." At the head table, Firth's voice sharpened. "Has anyone seen this dinghy?" Denholm hesitated. "Not personally." "And yet you announce its imminent arrival?" The letter states, Firth interrupted, "that the vessel is already paid for and awaiting transport. It does not state by whom, nor through what broker, nor with what funds." A fork clattered to the floor. Several heads turned instinctively toward the window, as though expecting to see a gleaming craft materialize upon the mudflats. Purbright considered the letter when it was finally passed to him, more from social pressure than procedural necessity. The paper was good quality. The wording is formal, almost ceremonious. There was, he noted, a faint odor of cologne, not commonly associated with chandlery invoices. "Curious?" he said gently. "Curious?" Firth echoed. "Only that generosity so rarely travels without an escort." Denholm stiffened. "You suspect something improper?" "I suspect," Purbright replied, returning the letter, "that if a boat arrives tomorrow we shall know more. And if it does not, we shall know rather more than that." Around them, the Yacht Club resumed its dinner with a forced determination. Conversation brightened artificially. Glasses were refilled, yet the word plaque hovered above the blanc-mange like a cloud. Outside, the estuary lapped indifferently at the mud. By morning, Flaxborough would discover whether it had gained a racing dinghy or merely an embarrassment. By morning, Flaxborough discovered that Embarrassment, like fog, had a talent for creeping in quietly and settling everywhere. Inspector Purbright arrived at the Yacht Club a little after 9, at the hour when respectable men felt industrious and doubtful men felt merely awake. The tide had pulled back, leaving the estuary a broad, brown apology beneath a pale sky. The clubhouse bunting still hung from the previous night, now less festive and more like a series of small surrender flags. Inside, Leonard Firth stood with his overcoat on and his patience folded neatly away. Commodore Denholm paced in short, important lines, as if the very boards might be impressed by his concern. "It's late," Firth said, consulting his watch with the air of a man who would happily invoice time itself. If a transporter were coming, it would have come. Denholm made a small, irritated noise. "There are traffic difficulties, roadworks." "The bridge by St. Bede's is always the bridge by St. Bede's," Firth cut in. "Cannot explain why nobody can tell us who paid for the boat." Purbright nodded once, mildly, and took in the room. A faint smell of polish and stale gin, a notice board full of committee decisions, and in the corner a brass ship's bell that looked as though it had never been rung in anger. He was aware, without needing to glance, that Mrs. Chalfont had arrived too, wrapped in a scarf that suggested both philanthropy and surveillance. Inspector Denholm said, brightening as though authority might be contagious, "I'm so glad you've come. It's all becoming rather awkward." "Awkward," Purbright agreed, "is an excellent Flaxborough word. It covers a multitude of sins without committing one." Firth snorted. "There's nothing poetic about it. Either a dinghy arrives or we've been made fools of." As if summoned by the sentence, there came the crunch of tires. On gravel outside, followed by a familiar shuffle on the clubhouse step. Mr. Gerald Pook, the caretaker, entered with a small parcel under his arm and the expression of a man perpetually accused of misplacing objects he had never wanted to see in the first place. "Morning," Pook said. "There's a chap outside asking questions." "What chap?" Denholm demanded. Pook blinked. "One of them reporters, I reckon. Notebook, pencil, the look." Firth's face tightened. "Already?" Mrs. Chalfont made a soft sound of satisfaction, as though the arrival of gossip in person proved the natural order was functioning after all. Purbright moved to the window and saw in the car park a young man in a too-thin coat speaking to no one in particular, his posture set to receive scandal. At the sight of Purbright's silhouette, the young man's pencil seemed to sharpen. "Have you told him anything?" Purbright asked Pook. "Only that the club opens at 9 and shuts when we've had enough," Pook replied, faintly, proud of this phrasing. "Quite right," Purbright said. "Mr. Denholm, perhaps we should meet him politely. It prevents him meeting someone else impolitely." Denholm looked as though he disliked the very idea of politeness being used as a weapon, but he nodded. They went out together. The reporter introduced himself as Mr. Crane from the Flaxborough Gazette, though his manner suggested he believed he ought to be writing for London and was merely doing the provinces a favour. "I understand," Crane began, "that the Yacht Club has received a remarkable gift, a new racing dinghy, anonymous donor, a plaque. All very romantic." "It is," Denholm said stiffly, "a private matter." Crane smiled. "Private matters are my professional interest. Has the dinghy arrived?" "No," Firth said, stepping forward. "And until it does, there is no gift." Crane's pencil danced. "So there is uncertainty." "There is," Purbright said, in a tone that made the words sound like something that might still be handled without. "Gloves and absence, uncertainty is what people build around it." Crane looked him up and down and recognized the inspector with the quick calculation of a man trained to detect obstacles. "Ah, police involvement." "Not involved," Purbright corrected mildly. "Attendance." Crane brightened anyway. "Does that mean you suspect fraud?" Denholm reddened. "There's no reason." Purbright allowed Denholm's protest to finish itself in the air, then said, "Mr. Crane, if you would be so good as to record that the Yacht Club is expecting a delivery later today, you will have done everyone a kindness. If it arrives, you will seem accurate. If it does not, you will seem prophetic. Either way, you will be pleased." Crane laughed. "Pleased already. Later today?" "Certainly. But tell me this letter. Who received it?" Denholm's hand drifted instinctively to his breast pocket. Firth's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Chalfont, behind them, listened with the stillness of a cat at a bird feeder. It was left, Denholm began, at the clubhouse. "By whom?" "A young man," Denholm said, and then, hearing how thin it sounded in daylight, added, "or possibly a delivery fellow." Crane's pencil paused. "Navy uniform?" "Something navy," Denholm admitted. Purbright watched the reporter's face register delight at the phrase. It had the vague, comic texture of truth. Crane thanked them and went off, already framing Flaxborough as a town both gullible and proud of it. Back inside, Firth shut the door with care, as though sealing out infection. "This will ruin us," he said. "Ruin is expensive," Purbright replied. "Embarrassment is cheaper. Flaxborough favours the cheaper commodity." Pook cleared his throat and offered the parcel he carried. This came in the post, addressed to the esteemed leadership, same as last night. Firth took it as if it might leak. It was a small cardboard box, neatly wrapped, no return address. Denholm stared at it with the reluctant fascination of a man watching a firework with a suspicious fuse. Purbright said, "Shall we open it?" Firth's fingers hesitated, then found the string. The box yielded with a soft tear of paper, and inside, nestled in tissue, lay a polished brass plaque tastefully discreet, as Denholm had promised, already engraved. The words were simple, even courteous. To Commodore Basil Denholm, in gratitude for his discretion for a moment, nobody spoke. Mrs. Chalfont made a tiny, involuntary inhale, as if someone had snapped a fan open in church. Firth's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Discretion," he said, "about what?" Purbright looked at the plaque a moment longer than the others. Then he lifted his eyes to Denholm's face and observed, with the calm of a man noting weather, that the Commodore had stopped pacing. He had, instead, gone very still. Denholm's stillness did not suit him. He was a man constructed for genial motion handshakes, small bows, modest laughter. Immobility rendered him oddly unfinished. Discretion, he repeated with an effort at levity. One likes to think it is a virtue. In certain circumstances, Leonard Firth replied, it may be a liability. The plaque lay upon the long oak table like an exhibit. Mrs. Chalfont leaned nearer, though not so near as to be accused of prying. Mr. Pooke retreated instinctively toward the door, as though proximity to engraved brass might incur responsibility. Purbright considered Denholm without staring at him. There was no visible collapse, no melodramatic protestation, only a faint paling at the temples and a tightening about the mouth. "Commodore," Purbright said gently, "do you have any notion why someone should thank you for your discretion?" Denholm's gaze remained on the plaque. "None whatsoever. It is a vulgar jest, someone with too much time." Firth cleared his throat. "The engraving is professionally done." "Yes, Leonard," Denholm snapped, then corrected himself. "Yes, quiet." Purbright lifted the plaque and turned it over. The reverse was plain, save for the maker's mark, a small stamped oval bearing the name H. Brackett and Sons, Trophies and Memorials. "Brackett's," Mrs. Chalfont said immediately. "On Market Street. They did the Jubilee Cups." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. Denholm seemed to recover some of his animation. "Inspector, you cannot possibly imagine that I am the object of some clandestine gratitude. It is absurd." "I imagine nothing," Purbright replied. "I observe that someone has paid to have your name engraved in brass." Firth folded his arms, "And not the club's name, not even Commodore of the Flaxborough Yacht Club, simply you." Denholm's expression hardened. "Must we rehearse this in front of everyone?" Purbright inclined his head. "Perhaps not. Mr. Firth, would you be so good as to keep the plaque safe for the present? I would like to make a few inquiries purely about the mechanics of its purchase." Firth gathered the plaque as though it might evaporate. Mrs. Chalfont, perceiving that the drama was about to migrate elsewhere, declared that she must attend a luncheon commitment, and departed reluctantly. Outside, the reporter crane was nowhere in sight, though the faint hum of the town suggested that his pencil had already been active. Purbright and Denholm walked together along the narrow strip of quay behind the clubhouse. The estuary lay slack and unhelpful. "You must see," Denholm began with forced reasonableness, "that this is malicious. Some members, disgruntled perhaps. There was that business last autumn, the mooring allocations." Purbright listened. "Tell me about it." "A trifling matter," Denholm said quickly. "A misunderstanding over waiting lists, and discretion was required." Denholm stopped walking. "Inspector, you are implying a scandal where none exists." "I am implying," Purbright said mildly, "that whoever sent the plaque wishes others to infer one." Denholm's composure flickered. "My life is an open book. Books," Purbright observed, "often have footnotes." They resumed, walking. Denholm spoke at length of committee irritations, minor rivalries, the peculiar intensity with which grown men disputed tide tables. There was talk of a recent proposal to increase membership fees which had not been universally admired. Yet nothing in his account seemed to justify engraved gratitude. Has anyone approached you privately in recent weeks? Purbright asked. Any conversation you considered delicate? Denholm hesitated, just perceptibly. We are a club inspector. Conversations are our chief product. Purbright let the pause linger. No specific matter, then? None. They reached the small car park where Denholm's saloon stood, in dignified blue. As Denholm fumbled for his keys, Purbright noticed something small lodged beneath the windscreen wiper, a folded scrap of paper, damp at the edges. Commodore, he said quietly. Denholm froze. What now? Purbright removed the paper with care. It was torn from a lined pad, written in the same careful, almost ceremonious hand as the letter of donation. Discretion, it read, is a commodity. Yours has been well compensated. Denholm's breath left him in a sound that was not quite a word. This is outrageous, he said. Yes, Purbright agreed, it is. Denholm looked around the empty car park as if expecting an audience to materialize from the hedges. You see? Malice? Sheer malice? Possibly, Purbright said, though malice seldom invests in engraving. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. May I ask, Commodore, have you received any unusual sums of money recently? Denholm's head jerked up. Certainly not. No unexpected deposits, no repayment of an old debt. Inspector? The protest carried genuine offence now. Purbright raised a placating hand. Forgive me, one must consider the phrasing well compensated. It may be metaphorical. Denholm's indignation wavered into something less certain. It is nonsense. I have nothing to hide. Purbright regarded him for a moment. Very good. Then we shall proceed on that assumption. As they parted, Denholm drove away with more haste than the key required. Purbright remained, watching the retreating car. The estuary had begun to stir with the incoming tide, thin ripples spreading over the mud. A racing dinghy had not arrived. Instead, a suggestion had, and it floated far more lightly. Purbright turned toward Market Street. H. Brackett and Sons had, he suspected, kept a receipt. H. Brackett and Sons occupied a narrow frontage on Market Street between a stationer's and a shop devoted entirely to commemorative teaspoons. The window displayed cups, shields, and plaques in ascending order of solemnity. Purbright paused briefly before entering, reflecting that Flaxborough possessed an impressive infrastructure for honour. Inside, the air smelt faintly of polish and ambition. Behind the counter stood Mr. Harold Brackett himself, a neat man with a careful parting and an instinctive respect for engraving. Inspector Brackett said as if, acknowledging an order he would prefer not to have received. How may I assist? Purbright produced the plaque, wrapped discreetly in brown paper. This passed through your hands recently. Brackett unfolded it with professional interest. Ah, yes, very clean lines, a simple serif. One doesn't often see gratitude phrased so directly. Can you recall who commissioned it? Brackett hesitated only briefly. A lady, Purbright waited. She did not give a name, Brackett continued. Paid in cash, very precise about the wording, spelled it out herself, age, middle-aged, respectable, gloves. He considered further. Navy coat. The Navy appears to be popular this week, Purbright murmured. Brackett smiled thinly. In Flaxborough, Inspector, Navy is an aspiration. Did she mention the Yacht Club? Only that the Commodore would understand. Purbright nodded. And the handwriting on the order form? Brackett retrieved a slim ledger and opened it to the relevant page. The inscription was copied. It was carefully in ink, but beneath it lay the customer's original scrawl. Purbright recognized at once the ceremonious hand from the letter and the note. "May I borrow this page?" he asked. Brackett looked alarmed. "It is my record. I shall make a copy." Brackett relaxed fractionally. "Naturally." Outside again, Purbright stood a moment in the thin sunshine. A lady in the Navy, gloves, cash. It was a description so broadly respectable that it might have encompassed half the town, and yet Brackett had spoken with faint particularity. He returned to the Yacht Club, where the atmosphere had acquired the brittle cheerfulness of people rehearsing innocence. Leonard Firth was in the small office, poring over ledgers with the fervour of a man who believed numbers might exonerate the world. "Well?" Firth demanded without looking up. "A lady commissioned the plaque," Purbright said. Firth did look up at that. "A lady? In the Navy?" Firth gave a short, dry laugh. "That narrows it to the Ladies' Sailing Auxiliary and 3/4 of the Mothers' Union." "Did any member of the club complain to you recently about the Commodore's discretion?" Purbright asked. Firth's pen paused. "There have been murmurs. About financial decisions, minor adjustments to maintenance funds, the new lockers, anything irregular?" Firth's lips pressed thin. "Nothing illegal. But Denholm has a way of arranging matters without full committee scrutiny. He calls it efficiency." "And you?" "I call it optimism." Purbright considered this. "Was there ever a payment made privately that you felt should have passed through your accounts?" Firth stiffened. "Certainly not." Yet the speed of his answer struck Purbright as less emphatic than it might have been. They were interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Rudge, whose presence suggested either boredom or an instinct for spectacle. "Terrible business," Rudge announced. "The town's full of it already. They're saying the Commodore's been blackmailed." "Are they?" Purbright asked mildly. "Oh, yes. Something about hush money, foreign investments. A woman." Firth looked horrified. "A woman?" Rudge shrugged. "There's always a woman. Makes it tidier." Purbright noted the phrase. Tidy explanations appealed greatly to Flaxborough. They reduced complexity to gossip. "Has Mr. Denholm seen today?" Purbright asked. "Left early," Firth said. "Said he had errands." "Important ones, no doubt," Rudge added. Purbright thanked them and stepped back into the main hall. On the notice board, pinned beneath a faded regatta schedule, was the original anonymous letter announcing the racing dinghy. It had been displayed as evidence of generosity. He read it again. The phrasing was formal, almost ceremonious. Yet one detail now pricked at him. The letter promised the dinghy would bear a plaque, tastefully discreet. Not a plaque honouring the club, but merely a plaque. The ambiguity, at the time, had been charming. Now it seemed deliberate. If the donor were the same lady in navy, she had never specified what the plaque would say. Only that one would exist. Purbright felt the faintest shift in his understanding. The dinghy might never have been intended to arrive. It may have been scaffolding something to ensure the club would display the letter publicly before the real message appeared. He walked to the window overlooking the estuary. The tide had risen further, smoothing over the mud. A tidy explanation of blackmail, scandal, and a woman would satisfy the town. It would also obscure something subtler. The plaque did not accuse Denholm of a specific act. It thanked him. And gratitude, Purbright reflected, was a far more complicated motive than revenge. Gratitude, once examined, tended to lead backwards. Inspector Purbright left the clubhouse and walked slowly along the quay, not in pursuit of anything visible, but in search of proportion. The town had already seized upon the idea of blackmail with the enthusiasm usually reserved for garden fetes. It had the virtue of drama. Yet the wording of the plaque and its quiet, almost courteous tone resisted the vulgarity of extortion. He turned over in his mind the small, almost overlooked detail in the original letter. The promise that the dinghy was already paid for and awaiting transport. It was a statement that invited verification. One could ask the boatyards, the brokers, the transport firms. One could, in short, expect a paper trail, unless the statement was never meant to be tested. By 11:30 he was seated in his office at the station, the anonymous letter and the copied inscription before him. Sergeant Love, who possessed an expression of permanent concern about sandwiches, hovered nearby. "Any sign of this phantom boat, sir?" Love asked. "None," Purbright replied. "Which is not in itself remarkable. Boats are elusive creatures when they do not exist." Love nodded gravely, as though he had always suspected as much. "Sergeant," Purbright continued, "could you make discreet inquiries with the principal marine suppliers within, say, 30 miles? Ask whether a racing dinghy has been purchased recently for delivery to Flaxborough Yacht Club. Right you are, sir. And while you're about it, inquire whether any such purchase was made in cash." Love's eyebrows rose. "Cash, sir? It appears to be a popular medium at present." When Love had departed, Purbright allowed himself a brief private glance at Denholm's financial history. There was nothing glaring, no recent windfalls, no unexplained withdrawals. The Commodore's account suggested a man who enjoyed his status but did not profit extravagantly from it, which left the matter of discretion. By early afternoon, Purbright returned to Market Street. He paused, not at Brackett's this time, but at a smaller establishment opposite Lister and Company, stationers and office supplies. In the window were pads of lined writing paper, identical to the sort from which the note beneath Denholm's windscreen had been torn. Inside, Miss Lister herself presided with brisk authority. "Inspector," she said, pleased at the prospect of usefulness. Purbright produced the note. "Do you stock this pad?" Miss Lister peered at it. "Standard college ruled. Dozens of customers. Do you recall selling one recently to a lady in the Navy?" Miss Lister smiled. "Inspector, in Flaxborough that is rather like asking whether I have sold tea to someone who drinks it." Purbright inclined his head, quiet. He was about to take his leave when Miss Lister added, almost as an afterthought, though there was one lady who bought 3 pads at once. Cash seemed in a hurry. When? Tuesday morning. Before or afternoon? Before, about 10. Purbright thanked her and stepped outside. Tuesday morning, the same day Denholm claimed the anonymous letter had been left at the clubhouse. He returned to the Yacht Club once more. Leonard Firth was again in residence, as if guarding the building against further gratitude. "Mr. Firth," Purbright said, "at what hour did the letter arrive on Tuesday?" Firth frowned. Pook found it on the hall table at 11. Said he'd seen no one enter. Was the clubhouse open? Technically. Denholm had been here earlier for a committee call. Alone? As far as I know. Purbright let the silence lengthen. Firth's gaze sharpened. "You don't suspect Basil himself?" he asked. "I suspect," Purbright said mildly, "that letters do not materialize without assistance." Firth gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think he wrote it?" "To what end?" "To create an occasion," Purbright replied. "An announcement, public expectation, and then humiliate himself." "That would depend," Purbright said, "upon whether he anticipated the plaque." Firth stared at him. There it was again, the trivial but persistent detail. The letter had promised a plaque but had not specified its wording. Denholm had assumed, or wished others to assume, that it would honor the club. Yet if he had written the letter himself, intending merely to bask in anonymous generosity, he would hardly have risked ambiguity, unless he had not written it, unless someone had wished to ensure that his own eagerness would expose him. Purbright walked to the notice board and removed the anonymous letter from its pin. He examined the fold. The crease was neat, deliberate. The envelope, which had been discarded, would have told him more. "Mr. Firth," he said quietly when Mr. Pook found the letter, "was it in an envelope?" Firth blinked. "I believe so." "And what became of it?" Firth looked faintly embarrassed. "We threw it away." Purbright nodded once. "Of course." He stepped outside to the bins behind the clubhouse. Flaxborough was not a town that discarded evidence efficiently. Among damp tea leaves and last night's paper plates lay a crumpled white envelope. Purbright unfolded it carefully. It bore no stamp. It bore no stamp and no postmark, which meant it had never passed through any system more complex than a human hand. Inspector Purbright held the damp envelope up to the light. The address, written in the same ceremonious hand as the letter, read simply, "The Esteemed Leadership, Flaxborough Yacht Club." No street name, no postcode. The sort of direction that assumed familiarity with doors. Inside the flap was a faint smear of something darker than ink. Not lipstick, the shade was too sober, but perhaps the residue of sealing wax, wiped away hastily. There had been, then, a small theatrical flourish at the point of delivery. He returned to the clubhouse with the envelope folded carefully in his pocket. Leonard Firth looked up from his accounts with the wary air of a man whose ledgers had already been invaded once that day. "No stamp," Purbright said. Firth's eyebrows rose. Then it was delivered by hand, almost certainly, by this mysterious young man in the Navy, or by someone who preferred that image. Firth removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. "Inspector, you're suggesting the description itself may be false?" "I am suggesting," Purbright replied, "that something navy is a remarkably convenient costume." Firth considered this with visible reluctance. "You don't think of one of our own? Let us say," Purbright said gently, "that I have yet to find evidence of an outsider." At that moment, Timothy Rudge entered again, drawn by the steady gravitational pull of intrigue. "Still no boat?" he asked brightly. "None," Firth snapped. Rudge glanced about. "It's quite the talk. Mrs. Denholm has been seen in town looking pale." Purbright turned his head slightly. "Mrs. Denholm?" "Oh, yes, at Lister's." Buying Rudge paused, searching for impact. "Stationery." Firth stared at him. "When?" "Tuesday morning, I think." "Or perhaps Monday. One loses track." Purbright's expression did not change, but something in his attention sharpened. "You are certain it was Mrs. Denholm?" "Well, I didn't see her at the counter, but Miss Lister said something about Basil's good lady being in a hurry." Rudge seemed pleased with this contribution and drifted out again. Mission accomplished. Firth replaced his spectacles. "That cannot be relevant." "Everything is relevant," Purbright said mildly. "The difficulty lies in determining for how long." He left the clubhouse and walked toward Denholm's residence, a comfortable house on Marine Crescent, with a view of the estuary that implied patience rather than wealth. The front garden was tidy, the hedges clipped with a precision that suggested a wish to control appearances. Mrs. Denholm answered the door herself. She was a composed woman in her early 50s, dressed in a navy coat. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady but not surprised. "I wondered how long it would take." Purbright inclined his head. "May I?" She stepped aside. The sitting room bore the marks of recent agitation, a newspaper folded and refolded, a teacup untouched. Through the window, the tide could be seen advancing with calm inevitability. "You've come about the yacht club?" she said, in part. She folded her hands. "Basil is out, so I gathered." A small pause. Then, "You believe he has done something foolish?" "I believe," Purbright replied carefully, "that someone wishes the town to think so." Mrs. Denholm's gaze did not waver. "And you?" "I prefer evidence to wishes." She considered him for a moment. "Very well. Ask. Were you in Market Street on Tuesday morning?" "Yes." "At Lister's?" "Yes." "Did you purchase stationery?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I did. For what purpose?" Her composure tightened slightly. "For correspondence related to the yacht club?" "No." "To your husband?" A flicker brief, almost imperceptible. "Inspector, I will not have Basil publicly humiliated over trifles." "Then you are aware of something that may cause humiliation?" She rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out toward the estuary. "My husband is an ambitious man in a town that prefers modesty. That is not a crime." "No," Purbright agreed. It is a risk. She turned back. If someone has contrived this embarrassment, it is not because Basil has taken money, it is because he has taken liberties. Liberties with procedure, with egos, with expectations. Purbright let the words settle. Has he taken liberties with you, Mrs. Denholm? Her expression sharpened. That is an unworthy question. Perhaps, he said. But this matter has been dressed in the language of discretion. Such language rarely confines itself to committee minutes. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. I bought paper, she said quietly, but I did not write that letter, nor commission a plaque, no, nor place an envelope on the hall table. No, her answers were firm, but not offended. Purbright stood. Thank you. As he reached the door, she spoke again. Inspector, if Basil has been foolish, he has not been wicked. Foolishness, Purbright said, is often punished more enthusiastically than wickedness. Outside, the tide had covered the mudflats entirely. The water lay smooth, reflective. Somewhere between the Yacht Club, the stationer's counter, and the Denholm's sitting room, a small, deliberate plan had been set in motion. And it was becoming clear that the field of suspects extended beyond anonymous benefactors and into the quieter rivalries of marriage and committee alike. By late afternoon, the town had begun to tire of mere speculation and demanded escalation. It arrived, appropriately enough, in the form of a boat. Sergeant Love telephoned Purbright just as he was making a note regarding the absence of postage on the discarded envelope. Something's turned up, sir, Love said, sounding as though he personally had dredged it from the deep, down by the old slipway, not a racing dinghy, exactly, more of a relic. Purbright walked the short distance to the slipway behind the abandoned chandlery, where a small crowd had already assembled with the discreet eagerness of citizens who disapproved of fuss but adored proximity to it. There, half grounded on the mud and half tethered to a frayed rope, was a narrow dinghy. It was not new. It was not fast. It bore the unmistakable fatigue of a vessel that had known both better tides and worse company. Painted along its side, in letters recently applied and only just drying, were the words, "Discreet Spirit." The crowd murmured appreciatively. "See," Timothy Rudge was saying to anyone within earshot, "it exists after all." Leonard Firth, who had arrived in a state of indignation, examined the hull with growing horror. This is not the craft described. This is barely seaworthy. Sergeant Love crouched beside the boat. "No plaque, sir." Purbright nodded. He stepped closer, noting the unevenness of the lettering. The paint was fresh, the brushwork competent but not professional. Someone had taken care, but not the care of a yard. "Who found it?" Purbright asked. "Pook," Love replied. "Came down to check the moorings and saw it drifting." Pook stood at a distance, as if proximity might imply ownership. "Wasn't here this morning," he said defensively. "I'd have noticed." Purbright studied the rope, securing the dinghy to the slipway ring. It was tied in a neat, practical knot. Not the flamboyant flourish of a yachtsman eager to demonstrate knowledge, but the efficient work of someone who had tied many small things in their life parcels, perhaps, or bundles of paper. Firth wiped his brow. "This is an insult." "On the contrary," Rudge said brightly, "it's a fulfillment. A dinghy has arrived." "Not the one promised," Firth snapped. Purbright walked around the boat slowly. There was no maker's mark, no registration number. Inside lay a single item, a small envelope weighted down with a stone. He retrieved it carefully. The address was familiar in its ceremonious precision. To the esteemed leadership. Firth made a strained sound. "Open it." Purbright did so. Inside was a single sheet. "The promise has been kept. The plaque awaits its vessel." There was no signature. A ripple passed through the onlookers. Mrs. Chalfont, who had positioned herself with admirable foresight near the front, inhaled softly. "This is monstrous," Firth declared. A mockery, or a correction, Purbright said quietly. Firth stared at him. The original letter did not specify the condition of the dinghy, Purbright continued, only that it was already paid for. This wreck cannot have cost anything. Everything costs something, Purbright replied, even ridicule. Sergeant Love looked up. Sir, there's no transport marks. It hasn't been delivered on a lorry. No, Purbright agreed. It has been rowed. The oars lay beneath a thwart, still damp. He straightened and surveyed the faces gathered along the slipway. Denholm was not among them. Has the Commodore been informed? Purbright asked. Not yet, Firth said. He's at home. Then let us inform him, Purbright said. The crowd dispersed. Reluctantly as Purbright, Firth and Love walked back toward Marine Crescent. The dinghy remained behind, tethered like an afterthought. At the Denholm residence, the door was opened by Mrs. Denholm once more. Her composure was thinner now. There is a boat, Purbright said. She closed her eyes briefly. Of course there is. Denholm himself appeared in the hallway, jacket hastily donned. What now? He demanded. A dinghy has arrived, Purbright said evenly, named Discreet Spirit. Denholm's face drained. This is persecution. Perhaps, Purbright said, or perhaps it is a conversation you have been postponing. Denholm stepped forward, anger overtaking embarrassment. I have taken no money. I have engaged in no scandal. This is spite. Spite rarely invests in paint and rowing effort, Purbright observed. Denholm faltered. Commodore, Purbright continued, who in this town believes you have been discreet on their behalf? For a moment, there was only the ticking of the hall clock. Then Mrs. Denholm spoke very quietly. Basil, she said, what did you promise her? The question hung in the air like a fresh engraving, precise, impossible to ignore. Denholm did not answer, and in his silence the second incident had shifted the matter from public embarrassment to something far more personal. Denholm's silence lasted only a few seconds, yet in Flaxborough time it was equivalent to a public confession. I promised nothing, he said at last, too quickly. This is absurd. You are all allowing yourselves to be carried away. Mrs. Denholm regarded him with a steadiness that suggested she had rehearsed patience over many seasons. Basil, she repeated softly, what did you promise her? There is no her, he snapped, and then seemed to hear the weakness in his own denial. Purbright did not intervene. He had learned that in domestic spaces, silence was often the most articulate participant. Denholm turned to the inspector with visible relief. You must see what this is. A malicious fabrication, someone seeking to tarnish the office. The office, Purbright said mildly, is made of paper and minutes. Tarnish tends to attach itself to people. Denholm flushed. Mrs. Denholm moved to the small writing desk in the corner of the hall. It was orderly, almost austere. You have been meeting her, she said, not accusingly, but as if stating a timetable, at the club, under the pretext of committee business. Denholm's indignation flared. I have met many people at the club. That is its function, Mrs. Elspeth Marr, she said. The name settled into the hallway like an unwelcome draught. Purbright observed the shift at once. Denholm's posture altered, not dramatically, but with the minute tightening of a man whose options had narrowed. Mrs. Marr is a widow, Denholm said stiffly, a recent member. She sought advice about sailing. About sailing, Mrs. Denholm repeated. Purbright spoke gently. Mrs. Marr is connected with the auxiliary? Yes, Denholm said. Recently joined, energetic, enthusiastic, and possessed of funds? Purbright asked. Denholm hesitated. She mentioned an inheritance. Mrs. Denholm's composure hardened into clarity. You told her the club needed investment? I told her, Denholm protested, that we were considering expansion, improved facilities, a competitive edge. And did you imply, Purbright asked, that her contribution might be acknowledged discreetly? Denholm stared at him. I did no such thing. Yet his eyes slid briefly away. Purbright felt the shape of it assembling, not a clandestine romance, not blackmail, but something quieter and more peculiarly Flaxborough, the courting of patronage. Did Mrs. Marr give you money? He asked. No. Did she pledge it? Denholm's silence answered more clearly than speech. Mrs. Denholm sat down slowly. You were going to announce a donation that did not yet exist. Denholm rounded on her. It would have existed. She was enthusiastic. Enthusiasm, Purbright observed, is not legal tender. Denholm's voice lost its bluster. She wished to remain anonymous. I thought if the club believed the funds secured, it would encourage her, create momentum. And the letter? Purbright asked quietly. I did not write it. Purbright believed him not out of trust, but out of instinct. Denholm possessed vanity, but not the patience for such careful phrasing. Did you tell Mrs. Marr that you would handle the matter discreetly? Purbright asked. Denholm exhaled. I may have assured her that her name need not appear publicly. Mrs. Denholm closed her eyes briefly. You promised her invisibility and then stood up before the entire club and hinted at a plaque. I did not hint at a plaque for her, Denholm protested. I assumed it would honour the club. Assumptions, Purbright said softly, are the most expensive form of optimism. He walked to the window and looked out at the estuary, now calm and impenetrable. If Mrs. Marr had felt misled, if she believed her promised discretion had been compromised, a public correction in the form of engraved irony would be both pointed and proportionate. Yet something remained misaligned. Commodore, Purbright said, did Mrs. Marr attend the commissioning dinner? No, she sent apologies. And since then I have not seen her. Purbright turned back. Where does she reside? Riverside Cottage, near the old ferry. Purbright nodded. I think it is time we paid Mrs. Marr a visit. Denholm stiffened. That is unnecessary. On the contrary, Purbright said evenly, it is overdue. As he stepped toward the door, Mrs. Denholm spoke once more. Inspector, she said, if Elspeth Marr has done this, she has done it with more imagination than cruelty. Purbright paused. Imagination, he replied, is seldom innocent. Outside, the town continued its murmuring. The second incident, the shabby dinghy christened Discreet Spirit, had shifted the narrative from scandal to satire. But satire in Flaxborough was rarely random. It tended to know its target very well. Riverside Cottage stood a little apart from the more ambitious houses on Marine Crescent, as though it had declined to compete. It was a narrow, whitewashed dwelling with climbing roses attempting discretion along the front wall. The estuary lay close enough for the tide to be heard in its slower moments. Inspector Purbright arrived without ceremony and was admitted by Mrs. Elspeth Marr herself. She was not, as gossip had already begun to imply, a figure of tragic romance. She was composed, self-contained, and dressed predictably in navy. Her manner possessed that calm exactitude often mistaken for fragility. "Inspector," she said, with no visible surprise, "I wondered when you would come." "I hope not too soon," Purbright replied. "On the contrary," she said lightly, "too late would have been disappointing." He was shown into a small sitting room that bore no trace of agitation. The furniture was modest but deliberate. On a side table lay a coil of rope, neatly wound. Purbright noticed it without appearing to do so. "You are aware," he began gently, "that a dinghy has arrived at the Yacht Club." "I heard," she said. "Flaxborough does not keep secrets for long, nor does it always understand them." Mrs. Marr smiled faintly. "Understanding is overrated. Reactions are more entertaining." Purbright seated himself. "You joined the Yacht Club recently?" "Yes, I was told it was invigorating. And you spoke with Commodore Denholm about possible financial support." "I expressed enthusiasm," she corrected. "He expressed expectations." "And you preferred to remain anonymous." "I prefer," she said, "to choose when I am visible." Purbright allowed the remark to rest between them. "Mrs. Marr," he continued, "did you commission a plaque?" She met his gaze directly. Yes, there was no flourish, no tremor. "And the original letter announcing the racing dinghy?" "Yes, you paid in cash." "Yes, you delivered the envelope by hand." Yes, her candor did not resemble confession so much as the closing of a ledger. "Why?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Marr leaned back slightly. "Because Commodore Denholm wished to trade upon my discretion." "In what way?" "He suggested," she said evenly, "that my interest in the club might be misunderstood. That anonymity would protect us both." "Protect you from what?" "From speculation, from implication, from becoming a convenient rumor." Purbright inclined his head. "And you objected?" "I objected to being preemptively concealed." She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the tide was turning. "He spoke of improvements, of expansion, of what my contribution might achieve." He was eager enough to discuss the announcement before any money had changed hands. "He announced it publicly," Purbright said. "Yes." "Without informing me, and so you corrected the narrative." "I restored proportion," she replied. "With irony, with precision." Purbright studied her. "The dinghy, a relic from my late husband's shed," she said. "It cost little. The paint cost more." "And the name?" "Discreet Spirit," she repeated softly. "A reminder of what?" "That discretion once claimed may be examined." Purbright was silent for a moment. "You intended no financial harm?" "None. I have given no money and lost none. I have merely declined to be used as a promise." "And the note about compensation?" She smiled faintly. "Metaphor, Inspector. He has been well compensated in reputation for being thought gallant." Purbright considered this. "You anticipated the town would assume scandal?" "Of course, they always do." It was the only way to make him feel the weight of his own suggestion. There was no vindictiveness in her tone, only clarity. "Mrs. Marr," Purbright said at last, "you understand that such public theatre can have consequences." "So can private presumption," she replied. He stood. "You have committed no crime," he said, "but you have orchestrated a spectacle." She inclined her head. "Flaxborough thrives on them. At the door," she paused. "Inspector," she said, "will you tell him?" "I shall ask him a question," Purbright replied, "and he will answer it in his own way." As he walked back toward the quay, the pattern settled into place. No blackmail, no embezzlement, only ambition misjudged and discretion misunderstood. What remained was to allow the Commodore, before witnesses, to recognize his own part in the embarrassment. In Flaxborough, that would be punishment enough. The emergency committee meeting convened that evening beneath bunting that had not yet recovered from optimism. Word had travelled efficiently. Members who had previously expressed only mild interest in dinghies now found themselves seized by civic responsibility. The shabby vessel christened Discreet Spirit had been hauled onto the slipway for inspection, where it sat like an awkward exhibit in a morality play. Commodore Basil Denholm stood at the head of the long table, a tempting dignity. Leonard Firth arranged papers with forensic emphasis. Mrs. Chalfont occupied a seat with exemplary visibility. Inspector Purbright took a place near the window, neither presiding nor absent. Denholm cleared his throat. "We are gathered," he began, "to address the unfortunate events of recent days." A murmur acknowledged that unfortunate was a flexible term. Firth spoke crisply. "A fraudulent letter announced a donation. A A plaque was engraved. A vessel of dubious seaworthiness has appeared bearing a name of questionable taste. "Indeed," Denholm said with brittle agreement. "Inspector Purbright has been kind enough to investigate." Several heads turned. Purbright inclined his head modestly. Kindness had little to do with it. Denholm gestured, inviting him to speak. Purbright rose without haste. The letter announcing the racing dinghy was written by Mrs. Elspeth Marr. The plaque was commissioned and paid for by her. The dinghy currently resting on our slipway belonged to her late husband. A ripple passed through the room. Mrs. Chalfont's lorgnette hovered. "There has been no theft," Purbright continued, "no financial irregularity, no blackmail." "Then what?" Firth demanded. "Has there been?" "A misunderstanding," Purbright said, amplified by assumption. He turned slightly toward Denholm. "Mrs. Marr joined the club recently and discussed with the Commodore the possibility of financial support. She indicated a preference for anonymity. The Commodore, enthusiastic for improvement, spoke publicly of a generous benefactor before any funds had been secured." Denholm's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Marr," Purbright went on, "considered this premature and potentially compromising. She chose to illustrate the consequences of promising discretion while enjoying publicity." A few members shifted uncomfortably. The engraved plaque thanking the Commodore for his discretion was not an accusation of corruption, Purbright said evenly. It was a reminder. The name Discreet Spirit was not scandalous. It was commentary. "Timothy," Rudge looked faintly disappointed. Firth frowned. "You mean to say there is no money?" "There was never any money," Purbright replied. Denholm's voice emerged, strained. "Inspector, are you suggesting I acted improperly?" "I am suggesting," Purbright said, "that you acted optimistically." A thin ripple of laughter escaped somewhere along the table and was quickly suppressed. "You spoke of a donation as if it were secured," Purbright continued. "You implied discretion without defining it. In doing so, you created expectations both financial and personal." Mrs. Chalfont coughed delicately. Purbright's gaze remained steady. Mrs. Marr's actions were theatrical, but not unlawful. They were designed to ensure that if her name were to be attached to generosity, it would be on her terms. Silence settled, heavier now, but clearer. Denholm looked down at his hands. For a moment, the Commodore resembled not a leader, but a man who had misjudged the wind. Firth broke the quiet. "So the club has lost nothing." "Nothing tangible," Purbright agreed. "And gained?" Mrs. Chalfont asked softly. "Perspective," Purbright said. There was a faint stirring at that, not approval exactly, but recognition. Denholm straightened slowly. "It was never my intention," he began, "to misrepresent matters." "Intention," Purbright replied gently, "is rarely the headline." A pause. Denholm cleared his throat again, less theatrically this time. "Very well. The announcement was premature. The matter of Mrs. Marr's involvement will not be discussed further." Firth nodded briskly. "And the dinghy?" "May be disposed of," Denholm said with an effort at humour. "Or restored, if someone wishes to adopt it." A small chuckle moved through the room. Purbright resumed his seat. The spectacle had been deflated without explosion, no arrests, no charges, only a modest recalibration of pride. As members rose and conversation resumed at a lower register, Denholm approached Purbright quietly. "You could have made this harsher," he said. "I could," Purbright agreed. "Why did you not?" Purbright considered the bunting overhead, now hanging more honestly than before. "Because," he said, "Flaxborough has already had its embarrassment. There is no need to make it a tragedy. In Flaxborough, resolution rarely arrived with applause. It settled instead like a change in the weather, noticeable only to those who had been watching the sky." The following morning, the shabby dinghy, named Discreet Spirit, remained on the slipway, but the crowd had thinned. It had become less a scandal and more an inconvenience. Timothy Rudge inspected it with diminished enthusiasm, as though satire were less enjoyable, once explained. Leonard Firth stood beside Inspector Purbright, hands clasped behind his back. "Well," Firth said, "we have been spared ruin." "Ruin," Purbright replied, "is a matter of scale." Firth allowed himself the faintest smile. "Denholm has written to Mrs. Marr, I would expect so, a letter of apology, properly worded." "Without plaques?" "Without plaques." They watched as Mr. Pook applied a tentative coat of neutral paint over the name on the hull. The letters of Discreet Spirit faded slowly beneath beige, like gossip being rephrased into something more respectable. "Will she give the money?" Firth asked. Purbright considered the estuary, which had resumed its ordinary rhythm. "That is a matter between Mrs. Marr and her judgment." Firth nodded. "The Commodore has been subdued." "Subdued men," Purbright said, "often become better chairmen." Later that afternoon, Purbright encountered Mrs. Denholm in Market Street. She carried a modest parcel and wore the same navy coat, though its authority seemed less defensive now. "Inspector," she said, pausing, "Mrs. Denholm?" She hesitated, then continued, "Basil has resolved to be less imaginative." "A wise resolution," Purbright said. "And Mrs. Marr?" She remains precise. Mrs. Denholm's mouth curved faintly. "That may be good for him. Precision, Purbright. Observed is not a quality to be feared." She inclined her head. "Thank you. For what?" "For not allowing this to become what it might have." Purbright considered the phrase. "Flaxborough has a talent for inflation," he said. "It was merely necessary to release a little air." By evening, the Yacht Club had resumed its familiar habits. The notice board no longer displayed the anonymous letter. Instead, a typed memorandum announced that future donations would be confirmed in writing and verified by the treasurer prior to public acknowledgement. The bunting had been removed. Commodore Denholm stood on the quay at dusk, gazing at the tide. Purbright joined him briefly. "I have invited Mrs. Marr to return," Denholm said without preamble. "On her terms. That is sensible. I did not intend to appear presumptuous." "Intention," Purbright replied, "is rarely the issue. Visibility is." Denholm exhaled slowly. "Do you believe the town will forget?" "No," Purbright said. "It will remember accurately. Enough." Denholm gave a short laugh. "And that is punishment?" "It is education." They stood in companionable quiet. The estuary reflected the last of the light, smoothing over the day's disturbances. Behind them, inside the clubhouse, Leonard Firth's voice could be heard insisting upon proper procedure for even the smallest expenditure. Timothy Rudge was already describing the affair as a masterclass in feminine strategy, though he was careful to do so at a lower volume. At the police station later that night, Purbright placed the plaque temporarily retained as evidence in an envelope marked "Resolved." He considered for a moment whether to return it to Mrs. Marr or the Commodore. In the end, he sent it to the Yacht Club with a brief note, "For archival purposes." He suspected it would be stored discreetly in a drawer where it would acquire the dignity of hindsight. Flaxborough had not gained a racing dinghy. It had gained a modest correction of ambition and a renewed appreciation for the exact meaning of discretion. As Purbright closed his ledger and switched off the light, the town settled into its usual watchful calm. Somewhere along the quay, beneath fresh paint, the outline of a former name still lay faintly visible, a reminder that promises once made public have a habit of floating back.